Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Anthony Connolly, and I'm President of the Society of Portrait Painters at the moment. It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker this afternoon, Richard Ormond. Richard Ormond has been the Director of the Maritime Museum, Deputy Director at the National Portrait Gallery, but he's best known in the circles in which I move for championing the reputation of John Singer Sargent. I think it's true that Nick Sirota said to him, well, because of you, we certainly won't forget him. It's a huge privilege to have Richard here this afternoon. As you probably know, Richard is the great-nephew of Sargent, and he's also been kind enough to lend us a very beautiful painting of his father and aunt, Conrad and Reine Ormond. And it's such a delight for us to have it here. Sargent was an honorary member of the Society, and it's his 100th anniversary this year. And so we thought it was appropriate to celebrate that fact and to have some representation. And it's quite difficult to borrow a Sargent painting nowadays. And so we are really grateful to Richard, and especially grateful to him for being here this afternoon. Thank you, Richard.
I'm going to just give a brief background to Sargent. Here he is in 1906, a self-portrait. He was born and brought up in Europe. His expatriate parents forgot to go home, and he was dragged around Europe and then trained. He showed his mother was very keen on her children sketching, and they always had to finish whatever sketch they'd started. Anyway, she got him started, and then they realized he was quite talented, and so they agreed that he could go and train in Paris. That was the place where you all trained. And he was in the studio of Carolus Durin, who, unlike many more traditional teachers, taught his people to paint from the word go, and to paint in terms of tonal values, les valeurs. The tonal values were all the talk, and you had to put a single stroke down each time. There was no sort of fudging. But he did also go to the École des Beaux-Arts, so he was very well trained in draftsmanship. And then he establishes a career which was quite difficult for an American. The French were very nationalistic, but anyway, he did boast some amazing subject pictures, and then he all came unstuck when Madame Gautreau. Currently, if you're any of you in New York, there's an absolutely smashing show, Sargent in Paris, on the early years of Sargent. At the Metropolitan Museum. Anyway, Madame Gautreau was a disaster, and everybody mocked him, mocked the picture, and it really set him back. And that led him eventually to come to England, and then the big breakthrough was a visit to the United States, when he's treated as a returning prodigy and given lots of commissions, and so on and so forth. And then in the 1890s, he really established himself as the great transatlantic portrait painter, and also starts a great mural commission in Boston, in the Boston Public Library, on the triumph of religion. And for him, he thought that was going to be his greatest contribution to art. Just to remind you of some of his portraits, the wonderful one of Lord Ribblesdale and Lady Helen Vincent. And of course, as Sargent and Fashion, you may have seen that exhibition. Sargent plays with fashion. I mean, this wonderful, great ballooning drape around, I'm sure that's Sargent adding to. And if you look bottom left, a little glimpse of the Grand Canal. She was painted in Venice. And of course, Lord Ribblesdale's is dressed as if for the hunt, but you'd never go hunting in a coat like that. So it's, and also, of course, American sitters, he's on both sides of the Atlantic. When people ask me, I say, was he English or was he American? And I say it was mid-Atlantic, but he kept his citizenship, and he said to people, I'm a good Yankee. And this is Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, who kept signing papers while Sargent was trying to paint him, you know. And this is, oh yes, she's rather good. Mrs. Fiske-Warren, who was a socialite, but also a poetess, with her daughter, and they're posed in the Isabel Stewart Gardner house, which is of course now a museum, in the Gothic room. And so I think it's a dazzling picture. And of course then the great formal, this is Sargent doing the Grand Manner with Consuelo Vanderbilt and the Duke of Marlborough, a very unhappy marriage. She writes it all up in a wonderful book called The Glitter and the Gold. Anyway, this is sort of Van Dyck plus, but so alive. That's the thing always about Sargent, is he may draw on all sorts of sources for his compositions, but his people are absolutely of the moment. Oh, by the way, yes, opening next week, Sargent's Portraits of American Heiresses is opening at Ken Wood. A small exhibition, but well worth seeing. So and it's the only significant, there is one in Broadway, a little exhibition, but it's the only, this is the centenary of Sargent's death, and this is the only exhibition of any note happening in Britain. And here's this is the top of the Boston Public Library, all the whole enrichments, the whole thing, and it's all about the triumph of religion, with at the end there the prophets, and this is the Assyrians and the Egyptians beating up the poor Jews. Anyway, it's rather wonderful. Yes, this is a vision of hell, a very original iconography of imagery that he used, and he really, they were painted in London and then taken over Mariflage, and then he added all sorts of things while he was working on it. So there's something like 100 different ingredients in these murals. They've been restored too. And then of course he loved going off in the summers to Europe, to Switzerland, the Alps, and to Venice, and to all sorts of places in Italy and Spain and so forth. And these wonderfully original and very painterly and very avant-garde in a way, I think. His handling of paint, his manipulation, his feeling for light and color. And this is just a very simple landscape, but it absolutely vibrates with the color coming through the trees. And now we come to the charcoals. Why did he take up doing charcoals? Well, first of all, he wanted to finish the murals, and he also wanted more freedom to paint things that he wanted to paint. I think also the feeling that he was always under pressure. He described a portrait, he talked about anxious relatives hanging on his brush, you know, all there. And also the feeling that he had to, each year he had to do one better. Otherwise people were going to say, oh, poor Mr. Sargent, you know, what a letdown, you know. So keeping up. So he said to people, well, I'll paint your fences, your doors, your whatever, but I'm not the human face. And so he really gave up to the shock. But Mr. Sargent, you've always painted us. What do you mean you're not going to paint us? Now, I won't paint you, but I'll draw you. And so he began doing these charcoals that he could do in a single sitting of 2.5 to 3 hours. And but even so, this became almost too overwhelming. He was too many commissions, and so he tried to. Then he put up his prices, but that didn't have much effect. And I've done a catalogue of the charcoal portraits. It's going to be published in June. This is my pitch, my sales pitch, and it's got 694 charcoal portraits, another whole portrait gallery, which are not well known because they're still in the hands of the people who commissioned them, including some in the audience, naming no names because of people that don't want to remain anonymous, and also the museums that have got them don't show them much. They're about a third American, a third British, 2/3 British, on fine art paper, French handmade papers, 24 by 18 inches, head and shoulders. And I think that they're so inventive. He's also playing, he's the person who arranges the jewelry and the look of the thing, and the costume again. It's all he's the director of the project, but he expects his sitters to play their part and not to kind of, it must have been rather intimidating. I'll come to some quotations, but as he thundered up and down his studio to make his mark and then go back to look at the result, all absolutely. And if it isn't working, he scraps the drawing. He's no good trying to make it work. This is rather nice. Yes, here we have the beautiful Duchess of Portland, painted at Welbeck. Isn't that a marvelous portrait? And here she is, a few years later, a charcoal portrait of her. Anyway, I think that's rather special. So there were about 30 or 40 people who were painted by Sargent were also drawn by Sargent. So this is really 1907 is when he gives it all up. And here, here he is in action. I think it's rather a pose. It's by Mrs. Sears, who was a great figure in Boston society, but she was also a photographer, and she's photographed Sargent drawing Ethel Barrymore, the American actress. Ethel Barrymore had a famous line. She used to end always her performances by saying, "That's all there is. There isn't any more." This was a sort of famous. And there's the inveterate smoker. You see he's got a cigar. Another rather nice, even older, I don't know exactly what he's drawing. And this is the studio at Tite Street, which is still, of course, there. This is the big studio, and it's all set up for a charcoal portrait to be done. I think it's going to come on the market, actually, Tite Street, if anyone. These are, I'm going to quote from these two ladies. On the left is, Cynthia Charteris and Alice Fielden. And Alice Fielden said, "He was a very quick worker, put the sitter on a chair close to the easel, then walked away to the end of the room and dashed back and forth to put in 2 or 3 masterly strokes with charcoal, then back again and so on, till the sketch was finished in about 3 hours. Sargent was most amusing and would dash off to play the piano in the middle of a sitting." That's too easy. When he had finished mine, he said, that is the cleverest thing I've ever done." I think that's rather, I'm not sure I believe that. Whereas old Cynthia's a bit more, she wrote, large, virile, plethoric, with protruding eyes and a sort of overboiled, throttled look. Sargent was in himself, as well as his art, as great a contrast to Burne-Jones as could be imagined. A curiously inarticulate man, he used to splutter and gasp, almost growl with the strain of trying to express himself. And sometimes, like Macbeth at the dagger, he would literally clutch at the air in frustrated efforts to find, with many intermediary ers, the most ordinary words. Anyway, that's, there you are. I'll just get to my, oh yes, he does do some early charcoals. Here we have Edwin Austin Abbey, who was another fellow American artist, also did a lot of work in the Boston Public Library. This is in the 1880s, and rather nice Clementina Anstruther Thompson, who was an artist, great friend and devotee of Vernon Lee, if you know who I mean by that, a critic of the time, who was a childhood friend of Sargent's. There she is. Okay. Also important to remember that Sargent not only drawing in charcoal, but also in pencil. There are lots of pencil drawings, but by and large they're not commissioned. They tend to be of friends. On the left is Gordon Greenough, who was another artist, and a friend. This is sort of 1880s, and that's 1890s, so it gets freer, the Emily Stevenson. I love Edward Silsby. He was a sea captain in the American Merchant Marine, and he got a passion for Shelley, rather unlikely, and he became a great friend of who's Shelley's half sister. I'm having a senior moment. Anyway, Claire Clairmont, and when he collected lots of things to do with Shelley, and when Claire Clairmont died, he tried to buy all her letters and all of that from the niece, from Claire Clairmont's niece, and the price was marriage. And Edward Silsby, like the hero of Henry James's Aspen Papers, who was inspired by Silsby, turned and fled. But anyway, isn't it a wonderfully sort of grizzled portrait? Helen Dunham was one of the Dunham sisters. They were known as the Blues because they were all terribly intellectual. So they were blue stockings, but they were called the Blues. And Helen Dunham was a particular friend of Sargent. They used to go to concerts and plays together, and all from New York. And of course, he's playing with costume. I'm sure he would have selected this quite fancy sort of evening dress. She hasn't got any pearls or any jewelry. And of course he takes the charcoal out. He used to do it with bread because anything else would scrape the paper. So you would create the highlights by removing the charcoal. And also it's interesting, he's either against dark backgrounds when he can play light against dark, or against plain backgrounds. And he obviously had to decide which he was going to do from the word go. And just to remind you that he's not only doing charcoal drawings for portraits, he's also doing it for all the murals. There are hundreds and hundreds of studies for the murals, because he also goes on to do another great series of classical subjects in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. That's the figure of Apollo, and this is the Joyful Mysteries. Yeah, I think it's the Joyful Mysteries. So he's very, from the word go, he's very skilled in the use, and you use the stump, you know, these different qualities and thicknesses of charcoal stumps. Oh yes, I mean, considering Sargent is regarded as the great Edwardian portrait painter, it's funny that he never painted Edward VII, instead of which Edward VII sat to a series of rather dreary portrait painters. But he did draw him on his deathbed in 1910. So there's the only image by Sargent. And just to run through some of his more famous sitters, that's of course Winston Churchill, drawn as Chancellor of the Exchequer in the year of Sargent's death, 1925. And this is the Foreign Secretary, Lord Grey of Falladon, who was Foreign Secretary for Dickens of a long time, and very influential. He had a famous saying, "The lamps are going out all over Europe, and we shall not see them lit again in our lifetime." That was his sort of prognosis on the First World War. And there you see two plain backgrounds as opposed to the dark backgrounds. And always very carefully drawn. Then he leaves him, the lower part is often swished in quite loosely, but very, very carefully, the line of the face and the chin and so forth. Oh yes, she's quite a one. This is Lady Desborough, who there was a group called the Souls, who were aristocrats, who were devoted to the arts and the higher things of the mind. They were slightly pretentious, if you like. And Lady Desborough was right at the heart of it. She was the heiress of the Cooper great collection of old masters, and she was also very rich in her own right. And she was a commanding figure, both in society and in the group of the Souls. And if you had a tete-a-tete with Lady Desborough, you sort of came out as if you'd been in the mangle. And another rather formidable lady, she was a charterist, born a charterist, Lady Devesky. She married an Irish peer. I think she's had a stroke, actually, because I think her face is slightly, but she's rather daunting. But the Charterist clan, the Earl of Weems is the title, were very close to Sargent. He drew and painted them, and the Evan Charteris was a trustee of the National Gallery, very much involved, wrote the first biography of Sargent. And that's a very dark, highly worked. So sometimes they're not so densely, and then sometimes he really goes, and there's really a lot of drawing in that charcoal. This is Lady Helen Vincent, whom we saw earlier in the picture when she was in Venice, a famous beauty, again on the fringes of the Souls. It's a wonderful, and here Sargent, I'm sure, all this lacy headdress that she's got on, and the sort of wrap here, I'm sure that's all arranged by Sargent, and to show her off to best advantage. And that's Margot Asquith, the wife of Herbert Asquith, the Prime Minister. She was quite a one, Margot Asquith. Somebody described her as entering, because she was the second wife, as entering the family like a meteor. And I think her stepchildren found her quite a problem, but she was very forceful, very sharp, and her sayings were known as Margot's, and people used to collect them. these Margaux. And this was the son, the son of Margaux, Edward Tennant. Sargent drew a lot of the young men who went to war. I think the parents often, and he never did posthumous portraits except for these young soldiers, where he made an exception, because he really, the war, really got to him, and so he would make exceptions. But this was actually drawn before the young man, who stands, Edward Tennant, stood for all those brilliant, clever young men who never made it. And he said rather touchingly to his mother, I think of death with a light heart and friend, whom there is no need to fear. And that sort of idealism, is very typical of the period in military costume. And of course he's also painting Americans, or drawing Americans. This is Edith Endicott, a formidable Washington hostess. Her husband was a minister, and I think it's an extraordinary outfit she's got on. I mean, she looks like a sort of Mother Superior, and she definitely, you feel looking down her nose at us, and look what he does with the darks. I mean, he just, isn't it? It's sort of, and then the head peering out, slightly cocked. That's a really densely worked drawing. Oh yes, two great Bostonians, Bigelow, William Bigelow. He was rather an interesting character. He's got a Japanese honor. He's wearing the badge of this particular Japanese, and he became eventually, was so besotted with Japan, he became a Buddhist, and he moved to Japan, and he collected a vast collection, which he gave to the Museum of Fine Arts, which has far the biggest collection of Japanese art outside Japan. So he was an exceptional. He apparently absolutely hated the drawing, was very rude about it, but I love that bushy, his bushy beard and so forth. On the right, a famous Harvard character, Henry Higginson, Civil War hero. He's got a great gash on his cheek, who endowed Harvard in all sorts of ways. He was actually painted by Sargent. There's a fantastic full length of him. And he also founded the Boston Symphony Orchestra. So a man of culture and as well as a Civil War hero. And there you've got the contrast of dark background and the light, plain background. There's the portrait of him, sort of rather Rayburn-like, leaning back in this dark interior, a sort of powerful figure with one arm linked over the chair. Oh yes, Bishop Lawrence, very influential ecclesiastic, who influenced the church in all sorts of ways. And this was a portrait that the family gave to the National Gallery of Art in Washington. And the son of Bishop Lawrence said, I'm so thrilled that the museum wants this drawing because we would like it 1,000 miles away. My father was not this austere, forbidding bishop that's represented by Sargent. He was warm-hearted and humane, and this is a travesty. And the other man, or another great Bostonian, is Abbott, who was the president of Harvard University. He was also, a few people managed to persuade Sargent to give up his rule of never painting portraits, and he, for one reason or another, no, Abbott Lowell is in his academic, again, somebody educationally who had a wide influence in America. Oh yes, I love this. Eleanor Sears, this is sport. Eleanor Sears was tennis champion of America. She also played squash, and she was one of the first women to fly aeroplanes. You can see, I think that great hair, swept back like that. You can sort of see her energy. And on the right is somebody called Dwight Davis, in military uniform. He was also in government, quite important, but Davis, he was also a tennis player, and the Davis Cup was founded by him for his fellow. He said to his Harvard, why don't we widen this tennis competition a bit? And so eventually that's what became the Davis Cup. Mrs. Green, with her son Stephen, this is the only double portrait I know, of charcoal, usually. So I don't know how she managed to persuade Sargent to draw her with her son, but it's rather charming, nice picture. And she was a figure in, again, the New England Society. And this is one of my favorite Sargents, Julia Barbour, clutching her doll. Isn't she enchanting? Though she was, as you can perhaps imagine, her family said she was very bossy, and the contrast between the heavily worked, isn't it, all this costume she's got on, with the rather sparsely dressed, that's Anthony Asquith, of the Asquith family, who became a film director in later life, but with his hair like that, very angelic little boy. And again, plain against dark. Wonderful feeling for light, the way Sargent lights these, particularly these dark ones, where he's playing light against dark and really bringing the character of the sitter out. They're so alive. Oh yes, George Meredith, the writer, he again was rather rude about this picture. He said, a face of gruel in which floated balls like the eyes of a codfish. But I think it's wonderfully, it's close up too, it's very intense. He did another one as well, Meredith, he knew Meredith, and the arch poet is Yeats. Curious enough, you'd think, Yeats said Sargent looked rather like a businessman, he said, but they kind of hit it off together. And I think Sargent captured the sort of the poetic and intensity of Yeats. I think it's a wonderful drawing. So here he is doing, and then of course Henry James, it was commissioned by Edith Wharton, and Henry James thought it was wonderful, the drawing, but Sargent wasn't sure, and he said to Edith Wharton, I'm not quite sure, that it's one of my best works, and if you don't want to take it, you don't have to. And Edith Wharton turned it down, and it ended up in the Royal Collection of the people who are members of the Order of Merit, they try and acquire portraits of all the people made. But a year later, Sargent did produce, I think, one of his great late portraits. He couldn't escape. It was Henry James's 70th birthday, and I think it captures the complexity of James's personality. I love the way his hand is hooked into his waistcoat. It's as if the great man is ruminating. And music, Percy Grainger, the young, beautiful young man on the left, and Gabriel Fauré, with naughty Mrs. Patrick Campbell sort of leaning over his shoulder. That they were at a weekend party together. And I think Fauré is playing the piano, and that's why he's looking down. Sargent was very, very musical himself. He played the piano. People said he could have been a concert pianist. And he promoted the younger composers and younger musicians. He was very, very into the musical world. And Gabriel Fauré was a controversial figure, certainly in Britain. Oh yes, Ethel Smythe was coming into her own, you know, as a composer. Yes, playing the piano, he asked her to sing the most lively songs she could think of, because he really wanted to get her really animated. And her naughty nephew said, "Oh, it's Aunt Ethel, and she's on a bicycle, and she's swallowing flies." And that's Loeffler, German violinist, part of the Boston Symphony Orchestra, in front of what I think is a model relating to the murals. So it's unusual in being a full-length image, because usually they're just head and shoulders. Oh yes, this is the Ballet Russe. Sargent was a great enthusiast, and this is Karsavina and Nureyev. Nijinsky, of course, yeah, which belongs to a very private club, so private that I'm not allowed to mention it. And she's as Tamar in the 1913, and Nijinsky is as Armide. So that's, and they were both commissioned by Lady Ripon, who was a great patron of and a great friend of Sargent. And the theatre, Gertrude Kingston, who ran her own company in London. I love this, isn't it fantastic? Sargent sometimes really goes to town, you know, in the opulence of the costume. And there's Ruth Draper, who used to do monologues in character. And this is her as a Dalmatian, and so a sort of Dalmatian peasant woman. And then she used to do, she was a fantastically popular character actress. Oh yes, Mrs. Charles Hunter. She was the sister of Ethel Smythe. Ethel Smythe, feminist, rather down to earth, and here's Mrs. Charles Hunter, opulent, the wife of a coal miner. She said she was going to use all of Charlie's money, and she did, and ended her life in genteel poverty. There she is by Rodin. She was a great collector, and her house in the country, she entertained the worlds of literature and art and music. She was larger than life, and probably somebody whom Sargent was as close to as anybody, because of course he never married. And there was one romance as a young man, but that never came to anything. But people like Mrs. Hunter I think, gave him, you know, the sort of intimacy that he needed. Oh yes, this is Nancy Astor. And there's a wonderful picture which is going to be on show of her with her hands behind her back, so animated. That's going to be at Kenwood, and here she is in a Charcot portrait. Isn't she lovely? Just worth saying that Sargent didn't like mounting his drawings. He liked them to be right to the edge, and the very simple, usually very simple frames. This is by Chapman Brothers, who were nearby in Chelsea. They were still going into the 1970s, and you could opt for a grander frame if you're prepared to pay a bit more. Oh yes, two very close friends. Philip Sassoon, the great aesthete and politician. In fact, it was he who made sure that Spitfires were being produced when the peace people were saying, no, we don't need to invest in the armed forces. He said, no, we must do it. He was a friend of Churchill's, but he was also an exquisite character and collector, and he used to organise these exhibitions in London in various venues. He's a really astonishing man, and that's his sister. I remember her very well, Sepple. She was quite Sepple, who married the Marquis of Cholmondeley, and she was a Sargent when he was there's a more elaborate, that's a C.M. May, this is a Chapman, that's a C.M. May frame. He was asked who was the most beautiful person he'd ever drawn, and he said Sepple. I'm just going to end very rapidly with, this is the family, this is Sargent's niece, Rosemarie, and Dorothy Barnard, who had posed for Carnation Lily Lily Rose years before. And Rosemarie was his model in the Alps. He was devoted to her, and he used to drape her in oriental costumes and cashmere shawls, and these ravishing pictures of her. And here she is in this, he used to call these intertwingles, and just, it's rather a tragic story. I'm very fired up by it all. She married a French art historian, medievalist, Michel. There she is in one of Sargent's pictures, enchanting, in the Alps. And he was killed in 1914, and she was killed in Paris when Saint-Gervais was bombed or shelled by the Germans in 1918, and they're buried here outside Soissons in Croix. And on the centenary of his death, I was here at this tomb, and we sang them with the mayor of the commune and the veterans, and we sang the Marseillaise, and it was very, very touching moment for me. Oh yes. Oh, this is Old Hat. That was a wonderful exhibition because it was the first time they were really shown. And then Sargent and Fashion, Sargent and Spain. It's been an amazing period. Thank you very much.
Will you take a few questions? Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much, Richard. That was absolutely fascinating, and lots of drawings I was completely unfamiliar with. And such beautiful people, and they're still here in the drawings. That's a strange alchemy of making likenesses. If anybody has any questions, Richard will take a few questions if anybody has anything they'd like to ask.
24 by 18 inches, 2 foot by 1.5. Yeah, with variations. So they're quite a good size. Yes, I mean, sometimes there's some pencil, and occasionally there's even some color chalk, but most of them are just plain charcoal. The whole point about him is painting from life, you know, that means, or drawing from life, that means that it's the here and now, using photographs, which of course is always a charge levied at portrait painters, that they're not actually doing from life, you know, which is of course much more difficult. But Sargent everything depended on the touch, and therefore trying to recreate somebody was contrary to all that he, you know, his whole training, his whole upbringing. Yes, yes, a particular kind of bread to erase, because you create the highlights by taking the charcoal out. So you draw and then you create, particularly in the hair, these wonderful wavy hair. I mean, it's, and of course it's you know, sometimes he's painting people rather simply, sometimes fully decked out. And I think that's again his conception. And I think he thought through, how am I going to do this, you know, and then he would think, you know, he'd get a concept of how he was going to do it, and then it all depended on, and that's why he used to you know, can I do each thing, it's not a kind of, he's not painting in a formula, he's each picture is a can I do it? You know, it's a challenge to him. Yeah, I mean, he used to say, "Oh, well, my mugshots." I mean, but I think, like any, yes, I mean, you know, he's very professional, and I think he wants to satisfy his clients. After all, he's performing a service, so I think he's very, yes, I think he does, he does exhibit, not very much. He does a few exhibitions, usually group exhibitions rather than individual exhibitions, so they don't get quite as much showing as the oils would have done. Well, Yves was a younger man and something of a protege of. I mean, they were very close, and Yves copied a lot of Sargent's oils, so they were quite close. And there are two splendid of Yves and his wife, two charcoal portraits by Sargent. But then there are people like Rothenstein, you know, there are a number of other portrait draftsmen about. But I think Sargent had that freedom, that kind of vitality. Well, he succeeded Whistler in a flat, or in a studio flat in 33 Tite Street, and then he acquired 31 Tite Street and knocked the two together. And he did, before he got Tite Street, he had to, yes, it was a year or two when he was in other rather unsatisfactory digs, and of course he spent a lot of time in Boston. He always used to stay in the Copley Plaza Hotel. They had a whole suite for him, you know, so that's where, and he had a studio as well. He's a sort of household name, really, and a dominant figure in the arts, which makes it all the more surprising that he gave up his practice as a portraitist. I mean, it's almost unheard of for somebody to shut up shop at the height of their game, as it were. Yeah. His mother was the one, his father was always moaning and saying to his relatives, I wish I could come home and blah, blah, blah. But it was Mrs. Sargent who was the one who was absolutely besotted with Europe. And she had a bit of money. And you could live much more cheaply in Europe than you could in America. And Emily, his sister, once wrote to a friend to say, well, we're only here for 6 months, so we can't have our own furniture. So they were always in furnished accommodation as a child, and going from pillar to post. I mean, you didn't really integrate with the local community. You met your fellow expatriates on you were in Florence or Rome or the south of France in the winter, and then you came north and you went to the grand cities, Paris and Munich, and then you went in the summer you went to the mountains, often to the Pyrenees rather than the Alps, and then you as the weather deteriorated, you went down south again. So it was, and you met a lot of the friendships were you met up with your fellow travelers, really. And that it's true of the mural studies, of course. They're much more free, if you like, and not necessarily. And he'll just draw a fragment or an arm or a hand or something. But the commission ones, that's it. You know, he's drawing them for clients, and he's not doing them, you know, for his own purposes. So, but I don't know of any sort of unfinished or secondary.
This is a sketch called The Musician, which John Singer Sargent did, and my grandfather, and they knew him because my grandfather was an artist. And my granny, she went into his studio because apparently she had beautiful hands. So he used to use her hands just to sketch. But anyway, here, because somebody mentioned something about a sketch. Well, this is an original sketch that John Singer Sargent gave my granny, because she walked into his studio and said, oh, I love that, I really love that, and just sort of, and he cut it out of the frame and gave it to her, and it's been sitting on the family wall for, you know, first of all at my granny's and then at my parents'. And interestingly enough, only a friend of mine, because I'm an artist as well, said, I told him about this John Singer Sargent, and my mother saying, oh, that painting is my pension. And that painting is my pension. And my friend said, you've got a John Singer Sargent?
Yeah.
I said, yes. Is it insured? I said, no. So I went to my father and said that sketch, which eventually, when he was doing sketches for El Jaleo, that was his friend just. And then, so I said to my father, we've got to get that painting insured. He said, oh, no. I mean, it's not worth anything. I'm not paying £500 to insure it. And so I forced him to get it insured. Bonhams came. It was sold eventually in Bonhams in New York for £264,000.
Wow, thank you very much. Did you know about this drawing?
Oh yeah, well no, it's a painting, of course I do. It's in the catalogue Raisonné.
Yes.
This drawing?
It's a painting.
That's a painting.
I can't
Oh, I
work
see.
out whether it's a painting.
No, he's absolutely right. It is. It's
Yes,
a painting.
but anyway, I thought you'd have an interesting because when the person mentioned are there any sketches, I thought,
Yeah, but just to say, of course, this is for a subject picture.
Yes.
For El Jaleo, but he did do little sketches for his oils, just to give an idea of the composition and play with them. And Madame Gautreau, there are about 30 or more drawings for that. So sometimes, but with the charcoals, I don't know of any preliminary sketches.
This is I thought it'd be interesting.
Oh yes, that's a marvellous
You can
thing.
have it. You can have it if you like. Have it. I bought it as a little gift.
Oh, well, that's very sweet.
Thank
I mean, you can see it on the
Yes,
That's fantastic. Thank you.
marvellous.
Hold on, I'll put the right one in the front. There.
I think we're going to draw this to a conclusion. Are there any more questions from the floor?
Oh, well, there are sometimes you can see finger marks. And, I don't think he was not, definitely fingerprints, so, which is not unusual. It's also, just mentioned one thing, that a photographer called Paul Labe took photographs, wonderful photographs, on 10 by 8 negatives that all survive in the Courtauld Institute, about 20,000 of them, and about 350 Sargent charcoals. And he used to produce facsimiles on fine art paper that are jolly difficult to tell from the original. So before you get too excited because you think you better look more carefully to make sure it is a charcoal and not Mr. Labe's masterly photographs.
Richard, thank you very, very much. Very small token of thanks from the members and the society. Thank you, Richard. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.